Thank you for joining us today. My name is Rita Glazebrough, and the practice leader at Real Chemistry, and I'm thrilled to be joined by Jeff Gartland, Adam Kaufman, and Dave Long today to have a really great discussion around the expanding ecosystem and direct-to-consumer healthcare. And we really see this as looking at the way that the pandemic has provided us with the great accelerator in some ways and the great equalizer in others as we get ready for more consumer-driven healthcare experiences and really working with companies to really figure out how to bridge from more traditional healthcare and legacy healthcare services into more consumer-driven focus. So thank you for joining us today. I would love to give a moment to Jeff, Adam, and Dave to just introduce themselves and describe their roles and give us a little bit of their perspective on how their experience has changed with their companies across the past 18 months. I'll start with you, Jeff.
Great, thanks, Rita. So by way of background, I'm Jeff Gartland. I'm CEO of Relation. This is a business that is really in and around how do we best enable providers in order to create a consumer-based experience for patients that they serve, whether that's from scheduling an appointment all the way through electronic registration and check-in and follow-up. So, the pandemic for us was a really dynamic time. Beyond the business side of it in terms of moving employees, very rapidly into a remote environment, the relationship and the communication mechanisms really immediately shifted overnight. In the early days, it really became how do we broadcast message out to millions of patients around changes in procedure, where to go, how to show up. And then over time, that's really evolved into a much more mature aspect that I'm sure we'll dive into around things like contactless check-in, and how do you follow up and how do you blend this digital and non-digital experience across the patient and provider relationship. And so, we're really excited around the changes. I think the pandemic, to your point, was a great equalizer and as well as a really revolutionary aspect in terms of this relationship that we've got between patients and providers. But it's also one that is really exciting because it's unleashed a lot of the weights that have been hanging on the healthcare world as it relates to consumer experiences that we have in other parts of our lives.
Dave, I'd like to go to you next. Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, Rita. So, and Dave Long, CEO and co-founder of Orange Theory Fitness. And so we were a brand that was born about 12 years ago to really bring science-backed, technology-tracked fitness to the masses. And technology-tracked in that we collect heart rate data more than once per second and telemetry on all the equipment. So you think of 60,000 data points per workout per member to help them get better workouts and better outcomes. And if you think about, as we think about the last 18 plus months, we went from doing about 10 million in-person workout experiences per month to shutting that down overnight, and then accelerating our digital interface and standing up in about 72 hours a digital workout of the day to service those customers basically for free through that period, and then transition from a combination of all digital complementary to a combination of digital outdoor and then back to our typical in-studio experiences. And so I think now it's, customer behaviors have changed, expectations have changed. So now I think for all companies, it's that blend of how to balance digital and in-person and find and value in those channels that's unique for those companies. And I think continuing to probably survey and interface with the customer even more to understand how their behaviors and their wants or needs are changing to continue to adapt to the landscape that's still very dynamic.
Wonderful, thank you. Thanks for joining us today. Adam?
Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Rita, and it's a real pleasure, Jeff and Dave, to join you, and thank you for having me on the panel. It's very interesting to be here as a member of WW. So I run our healthcare business, and we are a global wellness company, really thinking about how we interact more deeply in the healthcare ecosystem. So real pleasure to be here and share our thoughts. The pandemic, I think, did two things for us. The maybe more obvious one is transitioning some of our in-person services to digital, as Dave was describing. So for those who may not know, the transition from Weight Watchers to WW was about 4 years ago. and came along with a really deep digital transformation. So even pre-pandemic, we are a digital first company. All presence. And so in sort of 3 days, we transformed our studio business to a virtual only. I think we'll talk more about it, Rita, but we're now opening those studios again. We're maintaining those virtual workshops, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over time. And I think the other thing that happened, and we do a lot of consumer surveying, and so from our own internal data, March to April or early March to late March, 53% of our consumers reported being distracted from their normal health and wellness routines. So not only did this transition from in-person digital, but a huge transformation, sort of what people's priorities were, what they cared about, and how they wanted to interact with us, and I would argue the broader world. So we had to respond to both of those very, very quickly.
I would assume just an unequaled, let's call it that, an unequaled transformation for every company, whether you had a sort of hand or foot in healthcare or otherwise. And I'm interested to know too, to your point, Adam, about that 53% were sort of distracted, right? From it sort of, we just truly all had to shift. When you think about that from a, let's just refer to it as a traditional healthcare experience too, I would imagine that we also saw those expectations change, right? So in the wake of this, we see those expectations change. I would love to, Dave and Adam, I would love to understand from you whether in the past, let's just call it last 2 or 3 months, as we see this changing once again, if we're seeing those expectations sort of swing again back to highly focused, back to sort of wanting to achieve different goals, or do we think that there is a little bit of distraction still remaining in there?
Hey, Dave, I'm happy to answer first, but I am
go ahead.
Curious
I can add
all's experience, and you should know that WW and Orange Theory actually collaborate in a number of areas, so we probably have some similar. I would say, Rita, the pandemic was very much a sort of the impact it had on everyone was very similar, right? We sort of countrywide almost had to change our habits in a lot of the same ways. And with the reopening, first, it's not happening the same way all over the country. So some of our studios have different rules than others. But I think more importantly, consumers are responding differently. So some are very much ready to go back to the patterns they had before. Some internally, we talk about it wanting a moment of grace, where they had been removed from the world that they knew. And so I think this is very much an issue for healthcare. If you think about preventative services, if you think about elective things, some portion of the population is telling us we're just not ready to go back to those things yet. We've given up so much. We need more time. And some folks realize that their health and well-being suffer dramatically and want to jump back into our program or into the gym. And so we're dealing with sort of different responses across. I'd say it's not swung back as quickly as maybe the policies have. We see a lot of the consumers still wrestling with what's going on with the pandemic itself, as well as their own kind of needs to come to terms with what life looks like now.
Dave, would you add on and agree?
Yeah, I would agree, and I think the way we're kind of looking at our member base right now is I'd say about 3/4 are pre-pandemic kind of behavior pattern. And then there's probably close to a 1/4 that are, on the edge and, for a multitude of different reasons. And then when we just look at kind of seasonality overall, even putting pandemic aside, people starting a health or wellness habit, like a positive habit, really wanes as you get into November and into December. And it almost 90%, 95% of those folks push and then hit the reset button in January for a multitude of things. I mean, the kind of cliched New Year's resolutions are real. I mean, people really function like that still, and we are seeing a lot of that. But overall, again, 3/4 are kind of bounced back to the patterns that we saw before the pandemic started.
Which is wonderful for the business side of this too. And Jeff, I would love to get your perspective in here too. When you think about how the shift had to happen for providers, for hospital systems, going from sort of truly caring for the most who needed to be cared for, putting off electives, putting off preventative. Are you seeing that too in this sort of blending of sort of digital first, tech enabled versus where people are sort of coming back to? Have you seen it change across the last 3 or 4 months?
We have, and it's been quite interesting in terms of how that behavior shift has morphed over the course of the pandemic. So obviously, in the early days and through some of the spikes that we experienced, attention, appropriately so, in the provider world was triaging the issue at hand, dealing with overcrowding, dealing with the acute nature of the pandemic itself. And then obviously those that weren't directly involved in that were dealing with, how do you switch to virtual, and how do I do physical therapy remotely? How do I do behavioral health remotely? How does this all effectively work? So that most of the provider community has actually evolved through that and figured out ways, by hook or by crook, figured out ways in order to manage their business. And so as the rates have started to come back down in many communities, what we're now really seeing is this blend. There are aspects of that virtual environment that patients loved, providers loved, and there are aspects that just either physically don't work as well, or where the outcomes, kind of to Dave's point, sometimes those outcomes, and Adam's point, sometimes those outcomes are just better in person. And so how do we drive this blended world where the things that make sense to be done in a digital way can be done? And we see that, just in things like telehealth visits. I mean, at a certain point, the telehealth visits were nearly 100%. Those have come back down, and depending on specialty and region, somewhere in the 20, 30, 40% kind of range on a generalized basis. And so you can see the community of providers and patients really trying to find that new equilibrium of, if I don't have to go into a physical location, let me do it in a certain way remotely. But for other things, it does make more sense to do so. And so that equilibrium is still evolving.
So I would love to sort of ask all of you to sort of talk to me about this from a sheer demographic perspective, because I would imagine that there is probably, to this point of how are we balancing now this blending of digital and non-digital, and some people sort of creating that human interaction. I would love to understand from each of you the sort of trends that you're seeing potentially demographically, that we're getting this blend, differently across those. Adam, can I ask you to jump in first?
Yeah, of course. So I think it's true, and it probably does follow what you'd expect, that as you get older, you're still more likely to want in person, and I think that's carried through the pandemic. Although I think those who weren't digitally savvy had to learn, and so I think that age barrier is breaking down some. And we see in all of our demographic segments, folks who want to engage, only virtually, folks who want to engage deeply with coaches, folks who want to do it on their own, folks who want to go in the studios, folks who don't. And I think that's really important. Just to add another dynamic that I think we see through this is, so not only is it an in-person, virtual experience, which is what we're talking about, but I think the evolution of virtual to include live interactions that are streaming and engage you in a different way. So in healthcare, that's very much a telemedicine. We launched at WW right before the pandemic, actually, but very, I think, appropriately, a new coaching service that had live coaches who were streaming. It was more of a one-to-many approach. You see that in a lot of the fitness providers. And so I think we're exploring ways where it's not quite as binary. It's not like digital, do it yourself, or in person, but there's a blending, and sometimes the staff will be in person but also online. So I think we're experimenting with models that aren't quite as either virtual or in person, and those appeal across different demographics. But they do track what you'd expect by age, but not nearly as distinct as they might have been 2 years ago.
Dave, would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think a couple of interesting things from our arena is our demographics skewed slightly younger throughout this, which a lot of hypothesis is that just around people feel safer at a younger age going into a physical studio. we stood up a similar, type of channel where it was a one to not many, a smaller group setting, but the coach could see and coach and hold accountable the members for the programming. And as we stood that up, we also launched being a provider for the Optum program, which is, it's a 65 plus community. But that partnership, they really wanted the in-person piece of it, even though it was a weird time to start. And the penetration of that clientele wasn't great, but the folks that actually, jumped off the diving board and tried the studio have really good usage and really good adherence over a long period of time. We also really wanted to start sharing some of that data of how much the long-term health outcomes would change with even that population with a later start into that sort of exercise because of the way that we're tracking it. But on the flip side, we would love to work with that population digitally because we could more customize the actual curated programs for them through a digital, portal and still be convenient. But I think the demand of them being in person outweighed that out of the gate. So we're going to layer that in later and see how that goes. But I think that will be another test of a different demographic. Are they going to get on iPads and phones and do that sort of workout interface?
I think it's wonderful. And it sort of begs my next question, which is, I think what Orange Theory and what WW and also Religion use so well is this notion of having the data and analytics sort of at scale, right? At scale to really begin to understand how to make these determinations and decisions into what is this right blend. So Jeff, I would love to understand from you sort of where do you see this going, because we now have the partnership with companies like WW and Orange Theory and others to be able to sort of give that, begin to help us with that sort of data and analytics at the scale that would need to really impact how we could potentially be delivering healthcare from a more traditional and legacy perspective.
It does. And, the interesting piece and kind of where we see this going is really leveraging that data for impact. Aggregating and hoarding and storing data is kind of a step. Using it for our own, optimization and understanding our customer bases and those kinds of things is certainly something that's, done, has been done for many businesses for a long time. But really taking that and then converting it to, okay, how am I going to actually change behavior? How am I going to drive impact into a community or to marketplace is really where that ultimately goes. And, one of the areas that we see that is really it starts at the beginning of how do you first interact and engage with the consumer? Doing that coming from the provider healthcare world out to the consumer space versus consumer into healthcare. One of the things that's really important for our provider customers and clients to understand is that consumers do want to engage differently. They don't want to necessarily have to pick up the phone to schedule an appointment. They don't want to have to go to a traditional laptop and a website and a portal with 3 usernames and email addresses and passwords in order to interact with their providers. So how do you ease that into an experience that we would all typically drive? And whether that's through automation and chat, constructs first, or whether that's through SMS text messaging and asynchronous interaction with the provider ecosystem, what we see leveraging the data for is understanding that modality on how to best interact with the consumer and with the patient before, during, after their interaction with the healthcare ecosystem. That's not just designed on age. Age is one construct, but it's also designed on what's their chief complaint. What are they dealing with? What is their access to transportation? What other kind of social determinants do they have going on in and around them that's going to allow for them to best interact and improve the health for them and for their family over time? And so leveraging that data to make sure that you understand how the interaction begins is really, really key for us.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Please feel free.
I was going to pick up on that, and it's something that we talked about, and so I think Jeff's point is a really key one, which is sort of the intake, if you will, to figure out what service to provide. You need a lot of data about what services matter and what services that particular consumer wants. And it was actually in our prep call that I reflected on something. So I had a conversation with a clinician as we're developing some of our work. And what she said to me was, she said, great clinicians are often focused on the edge cases, right? So, their job is to make sure they don't make mistakes, they solve it. And what that I think means from a technology, if you allow me to connect it to AI for a second, is if we want to deliver consumer technology at scale, rightly, clinicians are sometimes afraid that we'll miss those edge cases, right? We may not have the program tailored to account for the dietary needs of X population because it's a small in the consumer area, but it's really an important thing from a clinical standpoint. I wouldn't say we're just getting there, but at global scale, we're just getting to the point where tools can personalize and tailor based on incoming data and trends so that we won't make those mistakes. We can deliver consumer grade solutions at scale that pick up those edge cases. And I think that's really important in healthcare. We're filming this on a weird day, if you allow me. So by the time this airs, WW will have announced a major innovation like we do regularly. And the core of that is personalization at a scale we've never achieved before. So each program will actually be individualized for an N of 1. Now, what that allows us to do is actually move into thinking about personalizing our programs along chronic condition lines in a way we couldn't. And so we'll be doing that first in diabetes and potentially other categories. So it's an example where we needed the data at a scale and the computing sort of at scale to actually begin to solve what's a reasonable clinical question. Okay, so the person has diabetes or diabetes and other comorbidities, what are you doing about it? And so I think we need that data and we need it at that level of processing to actually bring some of this technology into healthcare in a scale and in a meaningful way.
And I would also say too, and congratulations first and foremost, because it's a unique moment we all find ourselves in, and also this notion that with Jeff said earlier, this notion that it has to be seamless. So I can imagine, right? I can now, and I've worked in healthcare for almost 30 years. I can now, for the first time, almost fully imagine that there could be a seamless experience, right? Because I would imagine from each one of your points of view, it's been siloed, sometimes for purpose, sometimes not leading to a great outcome. But I think with all of the tools and technologies and new platforms we have at our disposal collectively, would you agree that we can potentially get to a seamless experience as people think about health and not just healthcare? Because I think that's also been the difference too, which is they have as a consumer, we have a connected mindset. Our health is not just when I go to get care. My health is around how I'm sleeping, how I'm eating, how much I weigh, how much I'm exercising. Jeff, would you agree that sort of from a provider perspective, that we're getting closer to that seamlessness?
Yeah. I've been around healthcare long enough to know, Rita, that anytime you put a date to something, it's always too ambitious. So, I would say we're on the beginning of that journey. We're beyond the starting gate, but it is a continuous effort that we're going to have to keep iterating on. And I would highlight one thing that is, I think, really one of the key elements here. If you rewind the clock 10 years ago, we were talking about how do we get to standards and how do we share data and a lot of the kind of the basic activities that are necessary in order for us to create the foundation and the building blocks. What we're really starting to hit on now is fundamental behavior change and a recalculus of some of the kind of long held blockers in terms of how one stakeholder is incentivized or designed or how they've always done something versus another stakeholder. And just baking that down to something very simple. An individual wants to schedule or create an appointment with a primary care physician, and that primary care physician may end up having to send them to a specialist. Each one of those three stakeholders have different needs, and they have different collective behaviors that they've entrenched themselves with. The consumer world with the pandemic has certainly been thrown up in the mix, but now we've got to go through and actually address some of those behavioral changes that we experience at the PCP, at the specialist, at the hospital, at the emergency department, so on and so forth, in order to really incorporate them in a smart fashion so that we balance all of those needs and demands and ensure that we do so in a kind of a North Star towards what ultimately makes us a simpler experience for the people that we care for. And I think that becomes a really important journey that we're about to embark on is how do we drive that behavior change, and how do we understand those incentives and the traditional workflows that different stakeholders have had and adjust them accordingly.
Well, and I would imagine, thank you, Jeff, because it makes complete sense. And I would also imagine, Dave, from your perspective too, having sort of really pioneered in this area around science-backed fitness, that there is a place, right? There is a place for that sort of to become part of this experience as well, which is those areas that potentially, to Jeff's point, like happen outside of the physician's office, right? Outside of a visit, but that are no less important to sort of our overall health and well-being. Can you speak to where you have found that sort of integration to be most successful, and are you hopeful that it will continue?
I certainly am. I mean, for me, it's kind of my, core passion why I want to be part of the business we're in for decades, not years, because I think this is going to be a long game. Like Jeff said, like I think it's not going to be a hard date, but I think the pandemic has also made people think more deeply about holistic and preventative healthcare. And so, the connection of, just mental health being brought to the surface more throughout this, the connection of other really important facets of wellness, like sleep, obviously nutrition, mindset, and this kind of proliferation of all wearable devices, ways for people to more early detect and prevent and monitor what's going on. I think the consumer will, and again, it's going to be over years, not months, but the consumer will continue to be more aware of these things and will be, applying pressure of how do they connect the dots with this. And I feel like that will drag parties along to start to pay attention to that. And you've seen just beds and bed cooling and sleep tracking alone has become a multi-billion-dollar industry. And so I think as all these pieces of holistic wellness bubble up, there's going to be a continued demand of how do you connect that, and you're going to have a lot of entrepreneurs that are going to want to figure out how to drive that along. I think obviously the massive healthcare system is much harder to have. It's a massive cruise ship to turn, but I do think that there will be enough pressures from consumers, from startups, that it will start to create, I think, a momentum piece so that we will start to move the ball forward.
Adam, I was assuming you would agree with that, given your purview as well. And given that WW tends to be one of those companies that puts the pressure on us to do it.
we do our best. So I absolutely agree with both. I think, Jeff's point that, we're past a debate about standards and we're actually living that is a big one. I'm super fascinated by, and I don't know if this is the industry, what I call sort of these vertically integrated consumer-focused healthcare companies. So, I think it started with Row, right, where you could market to a consumer about a health need, take them in, kind of a consumer intake funnel, actually deliver a telemedicine visit, prescribe meds. And it started in categories, not surprisingly, where there's like kind of consumer demand, they're a little harder. But, you're seeing it now into diabetes, into GI. And the reason I think that's so important is it will take disruptors to show that there's that kind of consumer interest and that we can integrate a stack that really before, it's mind-boggling to those who haven't been out of healthcare, but the complexity of ordering a diagnostic test, getting the results read, taking that to get a prescription, that's a process that should be infinitely simpler than it was. And these companies are responding to consumer demand to do that. And I think we'll build big businesses, but ultimately I think their bigger value will be in showing us that, we didn't have to federate in the way the industry was designed. So you go one place for your test, another place for your prescription, another place for your meds, but that we should organize that way more broadly. And that will bring the rest of us along. And I think those are some of the earliest examples. And if it had stayed in erectile dysfunction, we could have maybe discarded it, but it's everywhere now. And it's part of the reason we're thinking deeply in a WW standpoint about how do we interact in some way with what's going on in pharmacology, with devices, with telemedicine, because those innovators are showing that should be a much more seamless experience.
And I think the demand, right? The sort of demand for that personalization. So Dave, in your studios, right? I know my own performance at any one point in time, to your point, that sort of, I think you used the number 60 million, right? Like those are incredible forces when it's personalized for me, right? So I think, Jeff, the challenge becomes for a healthcare system, which has always been quote unquote designed, right? Not necessarily for personalization, but designed sort of for procedures and standards. And to Dave's point, it's a big ship to turn. But are we seeing that level of personalization and that level of knowing me, right, without having to go to 10 portals and sign in 17 times for various reasons? Are we seeing that as something we can begin to really work for? Because we've gone beyond the workflow, right? So we've spent, to your point, spent the last 10 years really working on the workflow to make sure that we could actually manage the system and connect the dots. Now that the dots are seemingly connected, do you believe that we can get to a level of personalization? And I would assume that providers are willing to go there.
Yeah, and it's definitely on the horizon. And to Adam's point, we're seeing that specifically within, slices of populations. So around particular verticals or bundles of activity, you're absolutely seeing that transformation and that change. I think an interesting one, for the larger health systems is when you really truly get to that N of one experience. A given person is not just a diabetic or somebody with COPD or somebody with a history of heart challenges within their family, or they are athletic and they're managing their weight and their cholesterol, or they're not. But really, how do you combine all of those together? And so, I think we've taken, as a health system collectively in the United States, we've taken the step of carving off slices that are either high cost or high dollar kind of areas, and really trying to navigate and verticalize those. I think it'll be a really telling stage in our maturity, in our evolution towards that N of one mass customization, when you can look at somebody that spans across those different verticals and start to connect those dots, not just around one scenario, but really their whole life and their whole journey through the healthcare world.
Does it beg the question of a little bit of redesign in terms of roles too?
I think it does. I think it does, in the sense of, we've talked about this in the work life. There's the great resignation, I think is the terminology going around there. It's really a rebalancing and a reconciliation of what our work-life balance is. I think they're similar. There is a reconciliation and a rebalancing of what are the roles and where do you define them. And whether that's in traditional mechanisms around whether it's an inpatient visit versus an outpatient, that's a very basic scenario. But really understanding where, who, and how care should be delivered, I think is going to be fundamentally going to be rethought for the number of years to come.
I want to sort of end our discussion on a question that really begs this, leaning into what the future looks like, which is, Dave, I think you brought up a wonderful point, which is there's going to be a tremendous amount of entrepreneurship that is sort of fitting in this middle space as we all begin to figure out how to build that bridge. I would love for each of you to sort of give us your best advice. Like, what's your best advice for those that are sort of potentially coming in, or those that are sort of struggling? We think about this blended experience, right? This struggle of sort of digital first, but not digital only. We use words like augmenting or supplementing, right? Which is, how do we get to that seamless experience? I would love for each of you to sort of just give your best advice for those that are coming in to make up the curve, accelerate from your observations. And Dave, if you don't mind, I'd love to start with you.
Yeah, and it might be more, specific around the journey. And I think there's a piece of this is around leveraging data and analytics that we've talked about. And I think a majority of companies rush to build a practice, but maybe don't answer the why and what are the unique solutions they're trying to find. And I think it becomes really powerful, just the problem of how to blend in-person digital, like this kind of these experiences that are going to change and shift. I think it's important for whatever the unique organization is that they understand what their value drivers are and where they're going to make the difference. They understand the journeys and where the friction is. We talked about being seamless and integrated, and that means very different things for different organizations and how their customers interact with them. So I think being able to really lay that out and understand where they're going to solve for, because you can spend tens or hundreds of millions of dollars mining and aggregating and processing and getting data ready to go, and it may not actually be not be able to use it to actually solve any of the problems or the friction. So I think it's taking a few steps back. We were fortunate enough to be doing that in 2019, and then we pivoted, as everybody did, to leverage the foundation we had built for recovery and for understanding our customer through the pandemic. But I think now, as we come out of it, there's a real opportunity for people to resurvey the landscape of their interactions and have a kind of a fresh start of a go forward. So some of the historic is important, but probably thinking of the now and then going forward may be the most critical thing to be thinking about.
Wonderful. Thank you. Adam?
Yeah, so two things. One, I think just echoing what Dave said, the base practice of understanding your consumer, what their user journey is, always important, but even more so when you're deploying it on multiple devices in multiple settings. We one of the product managers at WW I work with deeply was at Disney when they first deployed the digital bracelet, and all the thinking about how did that unlock your hotel room and what did that mean you could do and how did that get you special experience. And they really started like we would all expect with what's the consumer journey. And we think of that as a very blended experience, right? Like that bracelet becomes part of the magic, to give Disney credit, but also in what you're doing. But the other thing I'd add, and again to give Orange Theory credit, and it's a big practice at WW, is, and this is maybe speaking more to the consumer companies, science and evidence still really do matter. And this has to be, what is great about American healthcare and healthcare worldwide is that commitment to evidence. That's what took us out of snake oil. And so we can't lose that. You have to prove that these things work. Maybe little known, but at WW, we don't release any major innovation without running a third-party clinical trial on it. So even as a consumer company, even before healthcare, we wanted to make sure it worked. That's what allows us, I think, to go into healthcare. I think it's what it's going to allow Orange Theory to be successful compared to some of the other fitness companies, is that commitment to it. So I would just say, while we want to run fast and figure it out, we have to make sure we're actually delivering outcomes in a meaningful way that can be demonstrated and proven. Because if not, we don't move it forward. And that is different from, the consumer voice isn't the only one here. It actually has to drive meaningful health and cost outcomes.
Wonderful. Jeff?
Yeah, I'll double down on the comments that you all were making, and then add one element to it. So I really believe in understanding your purpose. When Dave talked about your why, you have to know your purpose. And in the pharma research world, when we think about data, you actually call it, are you actually building fit for purpose data? And the orientation of that is you have to understand what questions you are asking before you even really start that journey, and who that stakeholder is going to be, what the why is. And so I think it's really, really important to be grounded in your purpose and keep that North Star throughout. The second piece I would add, just when you say advice to give, I leverage the term creative destruction, but at the end of the day, it comes buckle up for change, be ready for it, be open to it. The evolutions are going to come, and sometimes they'll be slow, and sometimes they're going to happen really, really fast. And everybody always uses these different metaphors or analogies. And if you think about Blockbuster to mail order, kind of Netflix to video streaming, when you think about the pace with which that disruption occurred, you've got to be really open to the creative destruction and recognize that the business model of yesterday may not work today, may not work tomorrow, and not allow yourself to get stuck in some of the paradigms that we've had in the past. And so I think those two things, really understanding your purpose, your why, and then being open to that innovation is going to be key, and understanding what that means in terms of change.
Well, first and foremost, I could spend unlimited time with the three of you and have this discussion. So first and foremost, thank you for your contributions, right? The contributions that your companies have made throughout the pandemic and beyond, for making sure that we're always mindful of, to your point, Jeff, those disruptions that need to take place to move us forward. I can't think of others that would be part of this discussion. I thank you so much. It's been an honor for me to sort of facilitate this discussion and hear from all three of you. And so on that note, I just want to sort of exit us by saying we know that those creative disruptions are continuing. We're going to thank your organizations for continuing to be mindful of how we need to move the evolution of healthcare forward. And we thank you for participating today.